Hello, and welcome to Policy and Advocacy in Action, a channel of NRCDV Radio. My name is Miriam Durrani, and today I will be speaking to Tatewin Means from the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. Thunder Valley CDC is a Lakota-run grassroots community development corporation creating systemic change within their community, located on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. In the summer of 2019, Thunder Valley participated in a national work group on safe housing for American Indians and Alaska Native survivors, with a variety of other participants, and we were in awe of the incredible work they are doing and wanted to share more of that with you. You can learn more about the lessons from that work group by going to vawnet.org, that's VAWNET.org, and searching for the report. Let's hear more from Tatewin now.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tatewin Means, and I am an Indigenous woman from South Dakota. I am Sisseton Wahpeton Dakota, Oglala Lakota, and Ihanktawan Nakota. I grew up on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in a small community called Kyle, South Dakota. The first years of my schooling were in one of our tribal schools, Little Wound School, and before my mother and I moved to Rapid City, which is the border town to the Pine Ridge Reservation. Pine Ridge Reservation is one of 9 tribal nations in South Dakota, and it's located on the southwest corner of the state, which borders both Wyoming and Nebraska. We are part of the greater Oceti-Sakowee Nation, which is 7 council fires. So prior to colonization, we were one large nation that had 7 distinct nations or groups within it, and we are a part of that greater Oceti-Sakowee Nation. Originally our people spanned what is now South Dakota, North Dakota, up into Canada, as far east as Minnesota and west into Wyoming. And so that's who I am. That's where I come from. Currently, I live in Rapid City, South Dakota, which is about 80 miles north of Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, which is where I work. I have 2 children, Mankato, who is 18 and graduating this year, or maybe graduating this year given the circumstances that are happening right now.
Things are up in the air.
Yes, we're not really sure what's happening, but he's supposed to graduate this year. And then I have an 11-year-old daughter who's in 5th grade and very adamant about not redoing 5th grade. She's ready to be in middle school. So that's a little bit about me. My mother is Peggy Phelps. She comes from the Sisseton Wahpeton people. My father is the late Russell Means, who was Walla and Ihanktawan.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. So I know you mentioned Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. I think we want to talk more about that today. Can you tell us a little bit about the basics of Thunder Valley and how it came to be and what it's doing these days?
Absolutely. So Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation is a grassroots nonprofit organization that formally got its start, was formally incorporated in 2007. So, we're in about 13 years into operation. We have a staff of nearly 60 employees, and, that grew from just a handful of folks when we first got our start.
Wow, that's incredible growth.
Yes, our origin story is really connected to who we are spiritually as Lakota people. So just as a point of reference, American Indians or Indigenous people in the United States fought a long battle with the United States government to have the rights, our inherent rights, restored when it comes to the practice and exercise of our own spirituality and language and life ways. And that was encapsulated in the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act. There was a time in this country where our way of life, our very way of life and existence was outlawed. It was banned by the government. And there were very intentional efforts by the United States government through boarding schools, through Catholic boarding schools, to eliminate that identity for Indigenous people. And so the fact that our organization has its roots in our Lakota spirituality is really meaningful because of that history that's tied to that. You know, our ancestors fought for us to be able to do that, and for us to have that continue to guide our work is really meaningful for us. And so, you know, there was a group of young people before we got formed as an organization that came together, you know, and we have different spiritual circles, I guess, that are across the reservation. And, you know, it came together expressing their frustrations as to why our communities didn't have certain things, why other tribal nations, you know, had this or that, and kind of started complaining, right, or venting, as some people do when they get together. And
that's how great organizing starts. A little bit
right.
of complaining.
Yeah, and then some problem solving. And, you know, it was really a time a call to action. We like to talk about it as it was really a mirror, right? A mirror was held up before each of them at that time to self-reflect about what are you doing to change that trajectory, to change the course of our own people, right? Not allowing others to make those decisions. And, you know, and some guidance we received at that time. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so when you talk about the trajectory, so what sort of trajectory were you people and the organizers envisioning if there was no change?
Well, just this pervasive poverty that our people have been living in colonization, right? And the state of things in our reservation and tribal communities was very intentional on behalf of the federal government, you know, with laws, with policies, with court cases that really put parameters around and restraints on our rights as a people, as a sovereign nation. And so, you know, some of that disdain, some of that frustration was around the pervasive poverty, that poverty mindset and culture that comes along with it, where there's a lot of apathy, there's a lot of hopelessness. And so how can we regain that sovereignty? And so at that time, you know, some guidance that we received was, you know, words we hold very near and dear to this day is don't come from a place of fear, come from a place of hope. And that's something we continually have to remind ourselves, even right now in this time with this disease, you know, running rampant across the nation, reminding ourselves to come from a place of hope, not from a place of fear. And those words
I think that's,
you know, guided.
That's incredible grounding.
Yeah. You know, and they've guided us so far, you know, in all of our existence. And when we started, it wasn't like, okay, we're going to start a nonprofit and we're going to build houses or, you know, different things like that. It was a process of really meaningful engagement with the community. We've always identified as a youth movement, a youth station, because at that time it was young people with, you know, families that were just starting, careers that were just starting. So really a youth movement in that sense. And so the work that we do now is really based on community engagement, letting the people in the community be the guide of where we go. That's true grassroots, right? And so,
what does that
right now
community engagement look like?
How
do you go about it? What do you do?
Right. So a lot of face-to-face interaction in the community. Right now we're really re-strategizing on how to utilize social media and other digital forms of connection because of the circumstances we're in. But Indigenous people and Lakota people are very much social beings that like to engage and interact in person. And so it's really a struggle in this time because so much of our work is actually in the communities, making those connections, providing services, providing pathways. And right now as an org, you know, our vision is and really has always been liberation, right? So there's a lot of conversation in the general public around equity, making sure there's equitable resources, especially to marginalized communities, you know, vulnerable populations. And we really see that taking a step further into liberation, what that means. Whenever we talk about tribal communities, the word sovereignty comes up a lot. The word self-determination comes up a lot because those were actual acts or terminology used in reference to treaty law, in reference to specific laws pertaining to Indian nations. But I always like to remind people that sovereignty and self-determination is not something that is attached to government. It is something that starts within each person. And so our liberation as a people really starts from every individual finding their own personal liberation. And, my father, Russell Means, spoke about this decades before. And before, when I was in high school and hearing him talk about these things, I always thought it meant, an autonomous government that was not under the umbrella of the United States. And it could mean that, right? It could very well mean that. But what I come to understand now is that the words he would say is, it's the freedom to be responsible. That's the kind of freedom and liberation he was talking about. And when you think about the power of those words, freedom to be responsible, that everyone knows.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Their place. Yeah, they know their role. They know what they contribute to the society, to the community, right? And you don't have to be told when you understand that. When everyone's on the same page of what is right, what is good, and that means you have the same value system, right? And so we talk a lot about this on our workplace, right? The difference between accountability and responsibility. You have the responsibility to do your work, to be diligent, to be good stewards of the resources we have, rather than we're going to hold you accountable to do those things, right? So it's very much external and internal. So how do we reach liberation individually? Because then that sends a ripple effect to our families, to our communities, and then our nation. So that's the change we're hoping to effectuate, like from a really broad view, is that liberation. And really what we're doing is creating pathways to liberation. And we do that through 9 different initiatives in what we call an ecosystem of opportunity. And in this ecosystem, we address food sovereignty, our Lakota language revitalization movement, youth leadership, regional equity, housing and home ownership, development, which really aims at our 18 to 26-year-olds, education, and our regional community development initiative. And right now we sit on 34 acres of fee simple land within the reservation boundaries. And on this 34 acres is where we're actually building a regenerative community. All of the structures that are currently built and all of the structures that will be built are based on community input. What, most importantly, our youth wanted to see in a thriving community. So really redefining and liberating ourselves from the status quo of what's expected in a reservation community. So really changing the game.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound game-changing, absolutely. It's such exciting work. Mm-hmm. But how did you come up with what was in the ecosystem? I mean, that sounds, like it's some great values and great centering. So how did that come to be?
Yeah, so really all of our 9 initiatives work at addressing the social determinants of health. So the different areas of communities are often measured on the health and vitality of their spaces, right? But specifically, we came up with our 9 initiatives through a series of community engagement. Back in 2012, Thunder Valley CDC received a HUD, so the Housing and Urban Development Office. It was a Sustainable Communities grant. And as a part of that grant, we engaged in hundreds of hours of community engagement, and those were all direct face-to-face interactions. Some were with groups as small as 5 to 10 people. Others were larger with 200 people, in a gymnasium. But they were asked to envision what they wanted for our people, for our community. And the only request of them was that they stayed forward-thinking. It was easy to get bogged down in all the problems and what's wrong, but what we asked of everybody was to stay solution-based. And so from that came 12 areas of focus in what was called the Oglala Lakota Plan, or the Oyate Omichie, and basically served as a regional strategic plan for the tribe. It was adopted by the Oglala Sioux Tribal Council at that time and subsequently. And from those 12 focus areas, we developed our 9 initiatives. So when we say our work is built off of community input, it literally means that through that process.
That's incredible. So what do you feel like is one of the initiatives that resonates the most strongly with you? Or I know it's really hard to categorize favorites, but what do you feel the most passionate about at Thunder Valley?
Well, I hope none of my staff hears this, because then they'll think I have favorites. No, I know one of our priorities, as that it's reflected in our vision statement, is it's liberation through our language, lifeways, and spirituality. So at the root of everything we do is that revitalization of really our identity as Lakota people. And our language and lifeways are essential in that. And so, our Lakota language initiative, it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional, it's intergenerational. We service from our youngest relatives to our elders and everyone in between in that language revitalization movement. And so, that's at the heart of who we are. That's at the heart of what we do. So it's an important initiative. I think in having an ecosystem, that's exactly what it is. Not one is more important than the other, right? In nature, when you have an ecosystem, everything has a place, everything has a role. And that's really where I see our 9 initiatives working in balance. And I think that's an important word to remember, especially in our work, is a balance. That's a part of liberation, right? Restoring a balance, because colonization has pushed everything out of balance. I mean, obviously, look at Mother Nature, look at the environment and how it's responding. And so it's really a restoration of balance. And I think building a physical community, building structures is so important, because we're able to show community, look, it can be different. We can have the community we envision, the community that our kids want to see, that's thriving, right? That's not stuck in the cycles of poverty and oppression like so many of our communities face. But the other part about that is you can build the nicest buildings, you can build the most beautiful communities, but if you don't create those mindset shifts in your community, it's all for nothing, right? So people really have to work to liberate their minds, their thoughts from that poverty mindset and from that oppressive mindset. And that's why I really valued the work that I was able to do with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, had the National Working Group on Safe Housing, for survivors. And it was really important to be a part of that conversation, because you can't just look at it as a housing issue. You can't just look at it as a safety issue. It really is that, how are we ending these cycles of violence in our community, especially as Indigenous people, because they're so inspirational. And if we're not actively working on the prevention side of it and intervention side, then we're going to be downstream always fighting this battle of safety and protection and resource sharing. And so a lot
it's really hard to make that shift.
Right. Yep. No, so I really appreciate the work of the task force, because it was a space where advocates could gather with folks that are doing more community development and grassroots organizing around those kinds of things, all in one place, to really strategize on how do we make our communities safer for survivors, and how do we prevent that. And so a lot of the talk was about reconnecting. I mean, and that is something that's the strength of Indigenous communities. We do have that connection to who our ancestors were. And so, those teachings that have endured for thousands of years are still there. And so we're able to really rely on those in times of crisis, in times of hope. And I've been having so many conversations at this time around what's the response from your community? What's the response in Indigenous communities? And it's almost like we've been so accustomed to survival, right? And that's our work is really trying to move us past survival to thriving community. So we're not just complacent and acceptance of the status quo. And so I think when crises like this come up, it's almost business as usual, right? Because everybody is used to overcoming almost insurmountable odds every day and surviving. And so, the resilience of our communities really shines bright at times like this because that's what we've had to do since the point of colonization. So,
absolutely. It's such an important point to remember as well. So I know we don't have too much time left, but I just wanted to ask you, Thunder Valley is doing such incredible work, and everything that you've shared, there's so many themes, there's so many learning points from this. So are there any takeaways that you have for those listening? How can they try to emulate these models, or this model in particular, in their communities? And how do you feel like people should approach this?
Well, one, I think organizing the community is the first step. Anything that you try to do from a top-down approach is never really effective, and it's never fully realized because the people aren't a part of the process. So I think one lesson to learn from the work we've done at Thunder Valley CDC is really how to meaningfully engage your community and apply that engagement to the work. A lot of times Indigenous communities get consulted, right? There's tribal consultations from the federal government, from various entities. And it's a frustrating process because we never see the results of those conversations. We never see it applied. And so that's something that we are very cognizant of, that we don't want to repeat those same bad behaviors. We want to engage our community and really translate that into our work. So I think that's the first lesson. The second is know your community and know the place that you're in. And there's a lot of people talking about placemaking, right? Creative placemaking. And we like to talk about it in a way that's place knowing the land that you're in, the teachings that are there, the people that are there or were there for people that are in more urban areas, and reconnecting to that. For us, that's our own Lakota identity. And so having that knowledge and acknowledgement of where you are is really important. And then the last thing is, I think, finding ways to think about the community as a whole, having that communal mindset. And that takes a different worldview, right? That's the exact opposite of what capitalism and colonialism is about, where it's very individualistic. And returning to what is the greater good. And that includes the most vulnerable, right? Those on the periphery in our communities. How are we caring for them? Because that's the true barometer of how the health of your nation. That's the true barometer of the health of your communities. How are those that are most vulnerable being cared for? And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be a better relative in that way. And so I think that's the third thing I'd like to share.
That's great. So my last very quick question for you is, I know you've talked about the evolution of Thunder Valley, but what do you see for Thunder Valley, in the coming future and maybe like the next 10 years? What are your hopes for it?
Well, I hope that in the next 10 years we'll have, a significantly more of our regenerative community built. So, the physical structures in place. There are different plans that are in the works around, a commercial hub, a playground, a green spine space, more residential units for folks, and business and office spaces. And so really an interactive, thriving community. I hope that we are much further along in reaching those goals in 10 years. For Thunder Valley as an entity, I hope for organizational sustainability. Financial sustainability is really a priority for us right now. So identifying what our sustainability plan is and really putting concentrated efforts around fulfilling that plan, whether it's an endowment or, just a diversification of our revenue streams. so that we are here to serve the community for generations. And I think that in 10 years, I'd like to see us make a significant impact in our community around liberation, have it be a part of people's regular vocabulary and thought process, and that we've increased our fluent speakers in our community so that we have more people speaking fluent Lakota every day.
That's fantastic. I think those are all the goals that we can all certainly get behind. May 5th was the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, but this epidemic of violence knows no day, month, or year. Our partner and friends at the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center recorded this message to share with our audience.
American Indian and Alaska Native women face some of the highest rates of domestic violence and sexual assault in the United States. On some reservations, the murder rate of Native women is more than 10 times the national average. Abductions of Native women have become all too common. This, coupled with the many unresolved murders of Native women and girls, represent some of the most horrific aspects in the spectrum of violence committed against them. For those of us in the field, we know these disappearances and murders of Native women are often connected to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and sex trafficking. My name is Rose Quilt, and I am a member of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Indian Nation. And I currently serve as the Director of Policy and Research for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. As a National Indian Resource Center, we are committed to increasing safety and access to justice for Native women and their children. Part of our work involves bringing awareness to missing and murdered Native women and girls and advocating for the end of this horrific crisis. Resources that are culturally grounded and specific to the needs of Native victims are scarce. While there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, there are fewer than 60 tribal domestic violence shelters to support Native women. This is wholly unacceptable. Native women deserve justice. Native women deserve to feel safe. Native women cannot wait, and we need action now. May 5th is the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Native Women and Girls. Each year since 2017, advocates, tribes, and organizations have organized activities on May 5th to raise awareness and to commemorate the lives of those who have gone missing and have been murdered. May 5th was the birthday of Hannah Harris. Hannah was a 21-year-old woman of the Northern Cheyenne tribe who went missing in Montana in 2013. She was found murdered just a few days later as a result of a search that was organized by her family and community. And like in so many cases of missing and murdered Native women, the system was slow to respond when Hannah was reported missing by her mother. This failed response is not acceptable and must change. We wear red on May 5th for Hannah and for all missing and murdered Native women and girls. Their lives matter. Their stories matter. The National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Native Women and Girls is a critical opportunity to bring awareness to the need for ongoing grassroots advocacy. We need Congress to address the inadequate responses of criminal justice systems. We need more resources for tribal victim services and shelters to support Native women. And we need the full restoration of inherent tribal authority to not only enhance the safety and protection of women, but to importantly hold these perpetrators accountable for these horrific crimes. Native women deserve justice. Native women deserve to feel safe. Native women cannot wait. We need action now. On behalf of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, thank you for bringing awareness to the crisis of missing and murdered Native women and girls.
Thank you so much to my guest today, Tatewin Means from Thunder Valley CDC, for her insightful wisdom. To learn more about the incredible work of Thunder Valley CDC, visit thundervalley.org. And thank you to Rose Quilt at the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center for the incredibly powerful words on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. You can learn more about their work and this issue at niwrc.org. To hear more NRCDV podcasts and to access additional resources on gender-based violence and related topics, visit nrcdv.org. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at NRCDV. Policy in Action is an NRCDV radio podcast production brought to you by the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. Support is provided by the Administration on Children, Youth and Families, Family and Youth Services Bureau, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and did not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.